Whereby the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have tabled a strong position that would drive increased climate financing into the emerging and developing countries around the world. And as the thrust of this sideline panel that was held at the ongoing COP29 summit in Baku on Tuesday.
Good is good policies. The research we have been presenting tells us that if you have good policies, you attract more foreign direct investments. In fact, when you look at the countries that are record-setting in this regard, Chile, Uruguay, Vietnam, how do they do it? By having predictable regulatory environment long-term, by moving in purchasing power agreements that say you're investing in renewables. I'm sure you would agree with that. You're investing in renewables, they would be paid back for you. And this is what we excel at the fund, to work with countries to help them have good policies that would make them more attractive for private investment. But it would be unfair to stop here, because we also need the international financial institutions to massively step forward. I have been working in international finance for as long as I remember. And what I can tell you is that there is a dramatic improvement in the way we work together. Unprecedented cooperation. Why is this happening? Because of the urgency of what needs to be done. What we all recognize is that emission reduction is slower than it has to be, and most of it has to come from emerging markets and developing economies, whereas risks from climate shocks is bigger than we thought it would be. So imagine where we are. We have to mitigate and adapt at the same time with the same sense of urgency. This is what is making us here on this panel much more aware of our collective responsibility, and we have many examples that show how the way we work has changed.
Ever since I came here 17 months ago, you've heard me talk about the importance of getting the private sector into this, because there is not enough resources in the fiscal systems of governments or in our balance sheets to make this transition happen the way it needs to. So you have to get the private sector in. The reality in the case of that private sector lab is that it was aimed at renewable energy in the middle income countries. Very focused on that. So we would end up trying to create a limited space we could work on. And if solar and wind per unit are now cheaper than fossil fuel, then why is it that there aren't billions of dollars waiting on the doors of these middle income countries, beating the door down to go in? And it turns out there were 5 recommendations, all of which we are working on. The first one goes back to what Kristalina was saying. It's the regulatory policy certainty. Almost every investor needs to know that they can look forward to, with clarity, of what's the climate policy in this country, what's the investment climate, land acquisition, tariff policy, laws and court laws and so on. If you provide that, it makes a big difference. So while we're doing it in different ways, a tangible example is the 300 million people we're trying to reach in Africa with electricity by 2030. 15 countries right now, heads of state, are preparing energy plans, compacts, that will be presented at the end of Jan in Tanzania to private investors and other MDBs, including the IMF and other folks here, so we can talk about what is it that they're going to commit to do to make it more attractive for the private sector to come to their country.
But I would add to AJ's 5 points, I would add 3 more things that we're actually doing. First is investing in those public infrastructures that are absolutely indispensable for the private sector to thrive, like energy interconnectors, electricity interconnectors, without which it cannot have the balancing of the investments that may be put into renewables or others. Secondly, we're being innovative and creative in terms of financial instruments, from the Green Bond Fund to buy green bonds, to debt for climate swaps and conversion programs like the one we just did with the Inter-American Development Bank and Barbados. We're bringing in the private sector in those programs. And so we are effectively being innovative, I would say, in de-risking and trying to mobilize private finance. But the third area, and actually, Ajay, you and I mean, we're leading this, it's the GEMS project, which is what we're doing is we're providing very valuable data to the investment community. 40 years worth of detailed data on all the countries around the world and the experience of multilateral development institutions, financial institutions. We have put it all together, and it leads to two very interesting conclusions. First is that the likelihood of default is lower, and the probability of recovery is higher than one would have expected from less developed economies. So actually, investors can be attracted and can find a good business proposition in investing in these countries.
Looking at the emerging countries and developing world, and you know, we've developed projects in 40 countries. We are active in 23. Half of these countries are emerging or developing countries. We started our journey in an emerging country based in Abu Dhabi, right? So here in Baku, 2 days from now, we will be doing the financial close for 2 solar farms, around 700 megawatts. Last year, we inaugurated the largest solar farm in this country, 230 megawatts. What happened? We started the journey in Azerbaijan in 2019 with the support of the likes of EBRD, the IFC, working closely with the government. The government did not have regulation, nor they had a policy. They have never had an independent power producer as a foreign direct investor here. Most of the power generators are state-owned. They don't have PPAs. And even if they have a PPAs, this PPA is not bankable. So it literally took us almost 4 years to work with the government. But the reality is, the government should be ready for a change. Leadership is important. Without a leadership, there is no business.